Hello, scholars, and welcome back. So, today we are talking about quantitative and qualitative research, just an overview um, to help us understand different types of study reports. And the things we're talking about today, we're going to go into more depth, but let's just get a real good overview. This lecture is adapted from Plano, Clark, and Creswell, chapter 2. So we're on chapter 2. And I did not write this using APA style. I need to fix that for future lessons. Okay, that was slide 1. And let's go on to slide 2. So our objectives for this lecture are to identify the overall approach used in a research report as quantitative, qualitative, or combined, to recognize the key differences in the steps of the research process, depending on if a study is quantitative or qualitative, and to start to understand how we evaluate the quality of quantitative and qualitative research reports. Now, I'm not sure how long this video is going to go. I might split it into 2 parts. A lot of that is going to depend on if the baby wakes up from his nap pretty soon, or if he gives us a little more time. Okay. So first of all, some history, all right? So we have a real good context for this. Let's talk about Western knowing, and I'm talking about the Western world starting with Europe. Back in the medieval period, okay, so long, long ago, theology and mysticism were dominant. So I know a universal truth because the monks told me, right? And then we get the age of reason or the scientific revolution. And the scientific method, basically empiricism, I it the thinking, Bacon's thinking is, I know because I followed a set of procedures that led me to a universal truth. Okay, so it's no longer the monks told me, or I have this sacred text that tells me. It's I followed some procedures that led to this knowledge, this that is universally true. Or rationalism, deduction, Descartes, I know a universal truth because I can prove it through logic. Okay, so either we follow a set of procedures or we can logically derive a universal truth. And remember, the first sciences were astronomy, physics, chemistry, right? So what we now call the hard sciences. And then there's a shift because there's this thinking, hey, can we take these things that we're applying to stars and planets, and these things that we're applying to acids and bases, and that we're applying to, as we drop the apple from the tree, can we take these ideas and apply them to people? And then, so to translate the ideas of empiricism and rationalism to people, we get the I know universal truth about people because I use a scientific method. Now that's from Comte, right? But there's a difference. Comte actually coined the term sociology, the study of societies or people. The difference is that we're studying people. We're a lot more complex, and so the way of knowings may be different, maybe more comparative rather than following a logic, deducing through logic. But still, there's this idea of the universal truth that we can figure out through some kind of scientific method, and that is called positivism. And you might hear it referred to as post-positivism nowadays, because the post-positivism is the idea that there is still a universal truth out there, but we may not find it quickly and easily. It may take, a number of different scientific studies in order to figure out what that universal truth is. Now, So when we talk about quantitative research, often it's from this post-positivist view where there is a universal truth and we're going to use the scientific method to find out the truth out there. Okay. Then there was another shift in thinking, and we get interpretivism, also called anti-positivism. I cannot learn about the social realm using the scientific method, is the interpretivistic view. Okay. These are people. They're not atoms. They're not stars. Well, some of them may be famous, but they're not. They're not stars in the sky. They're people. Human beings are fundamentally different. And I can understand social action through interpretive means based on understanding the purpose and meaning that individuals attach to their own actions. So, unlike things in the hard sciences or the natural world, people have purposes for their actions, and there are meanings that they attach to it, that we can't simply figure out by observation or deduction, that kind of thing. And so and this is an idea from Weber, right? This idea that I I need to look from an interpretive perspective. How are individual peoples, human beings, interpreting their world, interpreting their reality? So no longer do we have this universal truth that applies everywhere all the time, right? Like gravity, let's say. But we have individual truths that we can only find out by getting to know how individual people are interpreting their world. Okay. And moving even past, and so most qualitative research falls under this kind of interpretivistic umbrella. Okay. So we have positivism associated with quantitative research and interpretivism associated with qualitative research. And then taking another step forward, there is critical theory. I can use social science to critique processes and institutions. And that's kind of the most recent epistemology, the most recent approach to knowing, and critical theories, and the most recent approach to research methods. We're not going to cover critical theory in this course, but you may come across that term when you are reading research studies. Okay. Slide 4. So, recalling from chapter 1, research is a process of steps that researchers use to collect and analyze information to increase our knowledge about a specific topic or issue, right? A topic or issue. So on the one hand, we have quantitative research studies that emphasize numeric data and statistical analyses to explain variables. So this positivistic view that there's, the universe in there, out there in the world, there are certain parts, there are certain variables that we can measure, that we can quantify. Qualitative research studies emphasize text data and thematic analyses to explore a phenomenon. Now, we talk about texts a lot in qualitative studies, but often those texts are derived from lived experiences. So it may derive from observing people interacting and taking field notes. And then you're interpreting, you're analyzing your field notes to understand individuals' interpretation of what's happening in their world. And then combined research studies or mixed method studies include both quantitative and qualitative research methods to understand a topic. Slide 5. Let's look first at quantitative research studies in a general way. Generally, quantitative research studies ask a specific, narrow question. So if you think about physics or chemistry or one of the other so-called natural sciences, they're usually exploring something very small. We're going to incrementally add to the body of knowledge about the universal truth, okay? Um, and and also you're explaining different variables or factors, specific concepts. So this idea of variables, things we can measure, things we can identify as being important for some outcome. We collect quantifiable data from participants. Again, things we can measure from participants, things we can count. And we analyze these numbers using statistics and graphs, a variety of mathematical procedures. We conduct the inquiry in an unbiased and objective manner, is what it says in Chapter 2. Let me tell you, from someone who studied quantitative research methods deeply while I was at Harvard University, and from the perspective of someone who has done a number of quantitative research studies, it is not unbiased. It is not wholly objective. The goal is to be unbiased. The goal is to be apart from the study. So what you're studying becomes the object. You're studying the object. You're studying something that you're apart from, that you're separate from. And in that way, you are objective. You're studying this object, something away from you. Okay, that's the goal. But everyone brings their own lens to their study, no matter how unbiased you try to be. Is it possible to even be unbiased? There are different statistical procedures that I learned and that I've used to try and minimize the bias that is going to enter into the analysis. But when it comes down to it, you know, as researchers, we bring our own lens to the work that we do. Okay. So how to identify quantitative research studies? Some words that might indicate them are experiment or correlation or survey or regression, that kind of thing. Words that indicate numeric data, things like variables, factors, measures. It may be a questionnaire or a survey instrument. Surveys can also be qualitative, but often they're quantitative. Words that indicate mathematical analyses, statistics, differences, comparisons, associations, and statistically significant, which is something I'm going to explain because it pops up a lot. We'll explain that as we go on in the course. Slide 7, qualitative research methods. Qualitative research studies. Here you're going to see broad general questions, broader, more general questions laid out. They'll still be fairly specific, but broader than you might with a quantitative study. You're looking at, in qualitative research studies, you'll see that the researchers are looking at individual perspectives of a single concept. Often, that single concept is often called a phenomenon. And the data that's collected consists largely of words or text from participants. So it might be that you interview someone and you have your transcript of that interview, or you observe, let's say, a classroom setting, and you have your field notes from that observation. Okay, so data consisting largely of words or text, but it does not have to be exclusively words or text. Perhaps you're doing a study around, let's say, depression in adolescents, and you want to do some art therapy with them. Well, then your data might be the drawings or paintings that they create while they're with you in a counseling session, or they're with a counselor and you're observing as the researcher. Okay. And the words or images are described or analyzed in search of themes. What are we learning from these individual interpretations of their own situation, their own world. What themes are we learning? And the inquiry is conducted in a subjective and reflexive manner. That means that not only am I studying people out there, but they're not necessarily objects that I am separate from. They are subject to their own world. And I, as the researcher, I'm also involved. I'm subject to my own perspectives. Okay, so I'm going to reflect on the process. I'm going to reflect on what I'm learning. I'm going to reflect on my findings. And I am also subject to the same kind of my life history and that kind of thing that I'm bringing in to the research. Okay. How do you identify qualitative research studies? Some words that you might see are things like narrative or case study or ethnography. Grounded theory is also a method of qualitative research. And words that indicate narrative or text-based data might be things like, oh, we did an interview, we did a focus group, we transcribed our data, we have a transcription, we have field notes, those kinds of things. Words that indicate textual analysis, maybe words like themes, codes, content analysis, description, perspectives, that kind of thing. Okay, let's see. Slide 9. Now, for combined research studies, you may see a combination of a narrow specific question and a broad or general question. And often research studies will have more than one research question. There may be variables that are counted or measured in some way, and a phenomenon might be explored from the perspective of participants. There may be data that's both numbers and words. So we did a numeric survey and we interviewed some of the participants. And the data may be analyzed for statistical trends and themes. So I might do the statistical analysis of the numeric data that I collected on the survey, and then I'm going to look for themes in the interviews. And the goal for combined research studies, usually called mixed methods studies, is to combine the two sets of results into an overall understanding of the topic. To identify combined research studies, they may say we did a quantitative and qualitative study, but most likely they'll say we did mixed methods research, or we use a mixed methods approach. One type of study is called action research, and we're going to be learning a lot more about that. Action research is particularly useful to those of us who are looking to do research within a professional context, whether it's as teachers or administrators in schools or as practicing counselors. And there might be conversation about within the study about integration or combination or multiple methods, and that's how you get a sense that they combined these two approaches. Okay, so now let's talk about some sections of the study. First of all, you have a problem. A problem, a literature review, a purpose statement, research design, selecting participants. And we're just going to briefly skim through kind of comparing these two from a quantitative perspective and a qualitative perspective. So a quantitative perspective, in terms of the problem, we're explaining relationships that exist among variables or measuring trends in a population. And when I say population, there's kind of like a specific methody definition, but you can think of it as just large group of people. Okay. And then for qualitative research, often is this exploration because little is known about a particular problem or issue, and we want a detailed description or understanding of a phenomenon. Yeah, I'm just making sure that I'm not getting texts about my daughter who's out on the town with her aunt and uncle and her cousin. I'm broadcasting today, by the way, from Boston, Massachusetts. So here we go. Okay, for the literature review. Wait, yeah, okay. The literature review is one of the first things that you'll find in a research study. So we'll start with the title, then usually there's an abstract, then an introduction, and then the literature review. Now, the literature review is essentially scholarship of existing literature on a particular topic. And by scholarship, I mean an understanding of existing research or an understanding of existing knowledge, diving into existing knowledge. Okay, and whereas research, often you're trying to add to the knowledge that exists. Okay, scholarship, you're diving into existing knowledge and understanding and interpreting existing studies. So in the literature review, doing the literature review, you mostly do your review at the start of the study. Okay, what's the state of knowledge on this topic? And your review is going to prescribe the direction of the study. For qualitative research, however, the doing of the literature review can also be a dynamic process. So because you're exploring something that less is known about often, it would be dynamic. So you interview someone, they bring up something that's interesting related to your topic that you hadn't thought of, so you go back to the literature and to learn more about the thing that they mentioned. And it informs the researcher's perspective, but does not prescribe the direction of the study. And that's because basically the direction of the study for a qualitative study is more open to what the researcher wants to explore next. Okay. The purpose statement in a quantitative study should be specific and narrow and focus on measurable, observable variables. Whereas for qualitative research, it'll probably be more general and broad and focus on participants' perspectives about a phenomenon. And again, that's that positivist versus interpretivist approach. In terms of research design, there are two main research designs for quantitative research: experimental or non-experimental. For qualitative research, you can think of it as people choose either a general qualitative approach or a formal qualitative research design. Often the general qualitative approach is actually a phenomenological approach, which you're going to learn about later in this course. For selecting participants and collecting data, for quantitative research, okay, so we're trying to learn about a universal truth, right? We need a lot of people. We need either a large number of individuals, sites, or time points. And the instruments that we're going to use are going to have preset questions and responses, or be closed-ended. And we're gathering quantifiable or numeric data. Okay. Qualitative research, small number of individuals or sites, because we're going to be diving deeply into those individuals' understandings of their world. And so we might have also general or emerging questions to permit the participants to generate their responses, or our questions are more open-ended. And we're gathering, text or images. Slide 16. So let's talk about analyzing the data, reporting the results, and drawing conclusions in kind of an overview way. For quantitative research, statistical analysis is the main approach. And there are also graphical analysis procedures. Um, there are network analysis procedures. There are a variety of different procedures that essentially a computer can do. And the procedures are to compare groups, to relate variables, to describe trends, to make predictions, that kind of thing. The comparison of results with prior predictions, often called prior hypotheses, or the results of a prior study. Um, and and so essentially your when you open a uh, quantitative research report, you see numbers, you see graphs, you see charts, that kind of thing. For qualitative research, you have text and image analysis procedures. Now, you can still use a computer. There is software that can make it much easier, but essentially it's the researcher who's developing descriptions and themes, usually through a process of coding what they found, what the text they collected, the notes from their observations, or the transcriptions of the interviews. And the researcher develops statements about the larger meanings of the findings and personal reflections of the findings, which is one of the reasons why you hear people say that for qualitative research, the researcher is the instrument. It's not just, I'm going to take these numbers and plug them into my computer, but I am going to interpret also what I find. I'm going to make statements about the larger meanings, and I'm going to include my personal reflections. Okay. In terms of disseminating and evaluating research, for quantitative research, basically there are very standard fixed structures and evaluative criteria, because a lot of these methods, some of them are were developed early in the 20th century. So they've become standardized and fixed. And often the texts seem to be written in a more impersonal way, in a more objective way, where the researcher is separate from what they're researching. For qualitative research, there may be flexible or emerging structures and evaluative criteria, although there are standards associated with qualitative research and with qualitative research methods, and qualitative reports would be written with a more subjective and reflexive approach. Okay, that interpretivist approach. So, pop quiz. Which kind of study would answer the following research questions? Okay, question 1. Are there differences in the number of discipline referrals between girls and boys with autism spectrum disorders? So, let's see. If I'm asking that research question, that's what I'm interested in. Is my approach going to be quantitative or qualitative? Okay. So if you said quantitative, you're right. Keywords here, differences in the number. Okay, we're counting something. We're counting how many discipline referrals that girls got versus the number of discipline referrals that boys got. We're comparing those, okay, among kids with autism spectrum disorders. Okay, so how about this one? Question 2. What are the social experiences of a middle school girl? I need to change that. Or of middle school girls what are the social experiences of a middle school girl with an autism spectrum disorder? So let's say there's a middle school girl with Asperger's. Okay, what are her social experiences? Would this be a quantitative or a qualitative study? What do you think? Yes, if you said qualitative, you are right, because we're looking at we're looking at an individual and what her experiences are out in the world, okay? Um, yes, in terms of her social interactions with others. Okay, number 3. What variable best predicts whether first generation college students stay continually enrolled in college until graduation? Hmm. Staying continuously enrolled. Let's see, what variable best predicts? Is that quantitative or qualitative? Okay, let's think about what the variables might be. Whether they are working or non-working, um, whether they have a great deal of family support or not, whether they are raising a family at the same time as being enrolled in college. These different variables, if we can say, okay, these are the several variables that we're looking at, and we're going to determine which one is the best predictor, then that's a quantitative study. Okay. Number 4, do students exposed to animated science materials learn more if the animation is accompanied by sound or no sound? Um, for those of you who are, STEAM or STEM interested, there's this idea where science can be uh, easy to learn when it's stuff that we can manipulate, the children or youth can interact with, right? But often we're studying things that are either too small, like atoms, or too large in order for children and youth to manipulate. So maybe we might have animated science materials. Um, and and so we're saying, okay, learning more, that more is a key word that lets us know that it's a quantitative study. Yes. If we're comparing sound and no sound, learning more. Okay, number 5. How do students describe their experiences learning from animated science materials? Quantitative or qualitative? If you said qualitative, you are right. Because when we're looking at how students interpret, how students describe, how clients, how patients, how individuals describe or interpret, or how individuals talk about their experience in their world, it's a qualitative study. Number 6, what challenges do first generation college students from small rural schools experience as they enroll in college? Quantitative or qualitative? Challenges. Let's see. What might be some of the challenges? If I come from a small rural school, I'm enrolling in college. I actually was in South Dakota for a year, and um, I was at the University of South Dakota, and a number of the students were from small rural schools. Um, they experienced some challenges, like they're in an environment where there are a lot of people, whereas before they were in a small school where they knew everyone knew them, there was a sense of family and familiarity, and all of a sudden they're in this place where there's kind of an anonymity. That was a challenge for some students. Homesickness. Some rural schools um, have difficulty preparing the students well for college. Maybe so academic preparation might be a challenge. Okay, so we have these idea of what some of the variables may be, but this study can actually be approached from either a quantitative or a qualitative perspective. If we're gonna say, okay, I'm gonna give students a survey and they're gonna check off, okay, which of these were challenges for you, and we've already identified the challenge, what we think are all of the challenges that students might experience. Then that would be a quantitative approach. If we're going to interview students and say, who are, interview student, first generation college students who are coming from small rural schools and say, hey, can you tell me about what your first year, how your first year is going and what it's like for you? And are there anything that you would say, are there any things that you would say are challenges in this first year for you? If we're going to interview students and then interpret what they tell us, then that would be a qualitative approach. Okay, and of course we could do both. We might interview a group, a relatively small group of students to find out, like, what are all the things that they mention, and then we might survey a larger group of students to see how many of those students say that a particular thing was a challenge for them. All right, so the next slides, there's a summary on slide 19 of key differences in the research process. And then there are a series of slides about what to look for when you're evaluating quantitative and qualitative studies. And you'll see we're going to be talking about evaluation basically with each chapter. We'll be talking about how to evaluate studies, because it's not just about finding studies that exist. It's also about knowing which studies that we really want to use their results in our practice as educators or as counselors, and which studies maybe we think weren't as strong, and so we don't want to use their results. All right, so the baby slept. I hope you all have a great day, and I'll see you next time.